David Reyes had exactly $43 in his checking account and a daughter running a fever of 103 degrees. If you think that sounds like the beginning of an ordinary hard luck story, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, a single dad went toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful CEOs in the state, and won. If a story about an underdog beating impossible odds means something to you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you are not going to want to miss how this ends. It was a Tuesday in October when David's whole life came apart at the seams. He worked as a shift supervisor at Vantage Logistics, a sprawling regional distribution company that moved everything from furniture to electronics across 3 states. He had been there for 12 years. He had started on the loading dock at 19, worked his way into a supervisor role by 26, and had never once been late, never once called in without notice, never once given his managers a single reason to doubt him. He was, by every account that mattered, a model employee. But none of that mattered on the morning his daughter Lily woke up burning with fever and shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Lily was 8 years old, all elbows and knees and stubborn curiosity. The kind of kid who asked why the sky was blue and then asked why the answer was true. Since her mother had left 3 years earlier, a departure David rarely spoke about, except to say simply that some people are not built for the hard parts of love, it had been just the two of them in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. David worked the early shift so he could pick Lily up from school himself. He packed her lunches with a note tucked inside, usually something dumb like a knock-knock joke, because it made her laugh, and her laugh was the best part of his day. When she spiked that fever, David did what any parent would do. He called his manager, a man named Greg Sanderson, and explained the situation. Greg told him to take the day, no problem, family emergencies happen. David breathed a sigh of relief, bundled Lily into the car, and drove her to urgent care. What should have been a simple flu turned into something more serious. The doctor mentioned pneumonia was a real possibility and wanted to keep her under observation, run more tests. David sat in that sterile little room for 6 hours, holding his daughter's small hand while machines beeped steadily beside her bed, terrified in a way he hadn't been since the day she was born. He called Greg again to update him. Greg said to keep him posted, take whatever time he needed. 2 days turned into 3. On the 3rd day, David finally exhaled when the doctor said Lily's fever had broken and the pneumonia scare had passed. She would recover fully with rest and antibiotics. During those long hours in the hospital, David hadn't thought once about his job, his attendance record, or how the days off might look on paper. He'd thought about the way Lily's small hand felt impossibly light in his, about the 4-line taped to skin that still had a faint scattering of summer freckles across it, about a promise he made under his breath, more prayer than sentence, that he would trade anything. His job, his savings, his own health, if it meant she got to go home healthy. When the doctor finally delivered the good news, David had actually laughed out loud, a short disbelieving sound, and Lily, still groggy from the fever breaking, had asked him why he was crying if it was good news. He'd told her grown-ups sometimes cried when they were relieved, and she'd nodded like that made perfect sense, the way kids do when they accept an explanation not because it's fully understood, but because it comes from someone they trust completely. He drove home that night bone-tired but grateful, already planning to be back at work the following morning. He was not prepared for what waited for him in his inbox. A termination letter dated that same day, citing unscheduled absences inconsistent with company attendance policy and failure to provide adequate documentation. No warning, no phone call, no conversation. 12 years of loyalty reduced to a single paragraph of corporate language, signed not by Greg, but by someone David had never met. A name he would come to know very well in the months ahead. Richard Calloway, CEO of Vantage Logistics. David called Greg immediately, voice shaking with disbelief. Greg's response gutted him more than the letter itself. I'm sorry, man. It came from corporate. Calloway's been cutting headcount to hit numbers before the quarterly board meeting. He needed names. Yours got picked. Just like that. Not a decision about David's performance. Not a decision about his character. A name plucked from a spreadsheet to make a balance sheet look better for shareholders. For a week, David told no one. He sat in his apartment each morning after dropping Lily at school, staring at the wall, running numbers in his head that never balanced. Rent was due in 9 days. Lily's asthma medication needed refilling. The car payment was already a week late from the days he'd missed picking up overtime. He applied to every warehouse and logistics job within a 30-mile radius and heard nothing back. No callbacks, no interviews, nothing. It was as if he had become invisible the moment Vantage Logistics decided he was expendable. He started skipping meals so Lily wouldn't notice the pantry thinning out, telling her he'd already eaten at work even on the days there was no work at all. He sold the television, then the good winter coat he never wore anymore because he couldn't afford to heat the apartment past 62 degrees anyway. He kept a small folder of Lily's school drawings not out of sentimentality alone, but because looking at them reminded him why none of this was optional, why giving up wasn't a door he was allowed to walk through. Some nights he sat in his car in the apartment parking lot after Lily was asleep upstairs with a neighbor watching over her, just so she wouldn't see him with his head against the steering wheel, trying to figure out how a man could work 12 years without a single complaint and still end up here. To understand why David held on so tightly to that job, you have to understand what came before it. He had grown up the oldest of four in a household where money was always a season away from running out, where his own father worked 2 jobs and still missed most of David's childhood because there simply weren't enough hours in the day. David had promised himself, somewhere around 15, that he would do things differently if he ever had kids of his own. He would be present. He would be the one packing lunches and signing permission slips and sitting in the front row at school plays, even the ones with only 6 lines of dialogue and a cardboard tree as the entire set. When Lily's mother left, that promise became the entire architecture of his life. He never spoke badly about her in front of Lily, no matter how much it might have been deserved, because he didn't want his daughter to grow up measuring her worth against someone else's absence. Instead, he simply filled the space himself, learned to braid hair from a 5-minute video at 11 at night, learned which stuffed animal had to be positioned exactly where on the pillow or bedtime negotiations would stretch for another 20 minutes, learned the particular rhythm of a good father's exhaustion, the kind that isn't glamorous but is quietly, fiercely proud of itself anyway. Vantage Logistics wasn't just a paycheck to him. It was the stability that made all of that possible. The health insurance that covered Lily's asthma inhalers, the schedule flexibility Greg had always quietly allowed, the 12 years of seniority that meant something, or so he had believed. It was his sister, Marisol, who finally noticed something was wrong. She showed up unannounced one Sunday with groceries and found her brother sitting in the dark, unopened mail piled on the counter, Lily's small drawings taped crookedly to the fridge as if he'd been trying to hold on to something steady. When she asked what happened, David finally broke down and told her everything. Marisol, who worked as a paralegal at a small firm downtown, went quiet for a long moment. Then she said the words that would change everything. "David, that's not just unfair. I think that might be illegal." The next morning, Marisol brought David to meet Sarah Mendez, an employment attorney who had built her small but fierce practice, representing workers against companies that thought their money made them untouchable. Sarah was 41, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by intimidation of any kind. She listened to David's story without interrupting once, jotting notes in a leather portfolio, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she set her pen down and asked one question. "Do you have anything in writing? Texts, emails, anything showing your manager approved the leave?" David did. He had texted Greg the entire time, a paper trail of course, take the time you need, and keep me posted, hope she feels better messages, each one time-stamped, each one damning to the company that now claimed his absences were unauthorized. Sarah's eyes lit up as she scrolled through the screenshots. "This is good," she said quietly. "This is very good." She explained that under both state and federal law, an employee taking leave to care for a seriously ill child, particularly when that leave had been explicitly approved by a supervisor, was protected. Terminating him for that leave, especially while dressing it up as a performance or attendance issue, could constitute wrongful termination and retaliation. But Sarah was honest with David from the start. "This won't be easy," she warned him. "Vantage Logistics has a legal department the size of my entire client roster. They will drag this out. They will try to bury you in paperwork and depositions until you can't afford to keep fighting. Most people fold before it ever sees a courtroom." David looked at her for a long moment, then said the only thing that mattered to him. "I have a daughter who needs to see her father stand up for something. I'm not folding." Sarah nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across her face. "Then we're going to fight." The months that followed tested David in ways he hadn't imagined. He picked up whatever work he could find, hauling furniture for a moving company on weekends, driving for a delivery app late at night after Lily was asleep, once even mowing lawns for cash in the neighborhood. Marisol helped where she could, but she had her own bills, her own life. There were nights David sat at the kitchen table doing math that never came out right, wondering if he'd made the wrong choice, if fighting a company as large as Vantage was a fool's errand that would only cost him more than he had left to lose. Vantage Logistics, for their part, responded exactly as Sarah predicted. Their legal team buried David's claim in procedural motions, requested extension after extension, demanded exhaustive documentation for even the most basic facts. They brought in an outside law firm known for grinding smaller plaintiffs into settlements or surrender. In one deposition, a Vantage attorney spent 4 hours questioning David about his attendance record going back a decade, trying to paint a picture of an unreliable employee rather than the model worker his own performance reviews described. David sat through it all, jaw tight, hands folded, answering every question honestly, refusing to give them the outburst they seemed to be fishing for. During discovery, Sarah also tracked down a former Vantage shift coordinator named Tasha Whitfield, who had left the company on her own terms 18 months earlier and had no reason left to protect them. Tasha remembered the exact week David was flagged, because she'd been the one asked to help compile the attendance spreadsheet Greg's superiors had requested. She hadn't understood at the time what it was for. She simply pulled the numbers she was told to pull. When Sarah showed her the termination letter and explained what had happened to David, Tasha went quiet for a long moment, then agreed to give a sworn statement. "I remember thinking it was strange," she told Sarah, "that the list wasn't about who was bad at their job. It was about who had used the most time off, no matter why. David's name was near the top, and everybody on that floor knew exactly why he'd been out that week." Her statement wouldn't single-handedly win the case, but it gave Sarah something crucial: a witness inside the building, who could describe in plain language that the criteria for termination had never been performance at all. Richard Calloway himself remained a distant, untouchable figure throughout most of this, the kind of executive who issued directives from a glass office on the top floor and never had to see the faces of the people those directives affected. He had built Vantage Logistics from a regional trucking outfit into a company worth hundreds of millions, and he had done it, by his own admission in an old industry magazine profile Sarah found during discovery, by being willing to make the hard calls other CEOs are too sentimental to make. David read that quote more than once, feeling something harden in his chest each time. The turning point came nearly 8 months into the case, when Sarah's team uncovered internal emails during discovery. Emails Vantage's legal department had fought hard to keep sealed. In them, Richard Calloway had personally instructed his HR director to identify employees to terminate ahead of the quarterly board meeting in order to present improved cost per employee metrics to investors. One email in particular would become the case's defining piece of evidence. In it, Calloway wrote that supervisors should prioritize cutting employees who had used excessive leave regardless of documented reason, specifically to avoid the appearance of the company being too generous with time off before the board review. David's name appeared on an attached spreadsheet, flagged the very week he had been in the hospital with Lily. When Sarah showed David that email for the first time, he had to leave the room. He stood in the hallway of her office building, hands braced against the wall, breathing hard, because there it was in black and white, proof that his daughter's illness had been reduced to a line item, that his 12 years of loyalty had been erased not because of anything he'd done, but because a spreadsheet needed to look better for people who would never know his name. That email changed the entire trajectory of the case. What had been a slow, grinding fight over technicalities became something Vantage Logistics could no longer bury in paperwork. Sarah filed to amend the complaint, adding claims of willful retaliation and violation of protected leave statutes, supported directly by the company's own internal communications. Vantage's legal team, sensing the ground shifting beneath them, offered David a settlement, a modest sum contingent on a strict non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from ever discussing the case publicly. Sarah relayed the offer to David without pressure, laying out both paths honestly. Taking the settlement meant certainty, meant paying off debts and putting the nightmare behind him quietly. Going to trial meant risk, meant more months of financial strain, meant facing a company with vastly more resources in open court, with no guarantee of a better outcome. David asked her one question: If we settle, does anything change for the next single parent this happens to? Sarah shook her head. No, it stays buried, just like they want it to. David didn't hesitate. Then we go to trial. The trial itself unfolded over 11 days in a wood-paneled courtroom that had seen 100 years of ordinary disputes and, that particular week, one that would matter more than most of them. David sat at the plaintiff's table each day in a suit that didn't quite fit him, hands folded, watching a parade of Vantage executives take the stand and offer careful, lawyered answers about company policy and business necessity. On the third day, Sarah called David's former manager, Greg Sanderson, to the stand. Vantage's attorneys had clearly prepared him thoroughly, and for most of his testimony, he stuck to careful, non-committal language about attendance policy and escalation procedures. But under Sarah's patient, methodical cross-examination, Greg's composure cracked in one small but telling moment. Asked directly whether he had personally approved David's leave at the time it was taken, Greg hesitated, glanced toward the Vantage legal table, and then answered honestly, "Yes, I told him to take whatever time he needed. I never once told him it would be held against him." It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it was an honest one, and honest answers, David would learn, tended to matter more to a jury than rehearsed ones. On the sixth day, Tasha Whitfield took the stand and calmly walked the jury through how the attendance spreadsheet had been compiled, describing in plain, unembellished language exactly what she had told Sarah months earlier. Vantage's attorneys tried repeatedly to suggest she was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind, but Tasha simply shrugged and said she'd left the company on good terms and had nothing to gain by lying under oath. Her steadiness on the stand did more damage to Vantage's narrative than any single document could have. Richard Calloway testified on the eighth day, composed and unbothered, insisting the termination had been a routine performance-based decision unrelated to David's leave. Then Sarah stood, walked calmly to the evidence display, and put Calloway's own email up on the screen for the jury to read in full, his own words, in his own voice, prioritizing the elimination of employees who had used leave, regardless of documented reason. The courtroom went silent. Calloway's composed expression, for the first time in 11 days, faltered. Sarah asked him a single quiet question. "Mr. Calloway, was David Reyes's daughter's pneumonia diagnosis a documented reason?" Calloway opened his mouth, closed it, and for a long moment said nothing at all. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours, though to David it felt like 6 days. He spent most of it pacing the hallway outside the courtroom, unable to sit still, unable to eat the sandwich Marisol kept pushing toward him. Sarah stayed calm on the surface, the way she had throughout the entire 11-month fight, but David noticed she kept glancing at the clock more than usual, and once, when she thought no one was watching, she closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, the only crack in her composure he'd seen the entire case. When the bailiff finally called them back in, David's legs felt unsteady beneath him. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and began to read. Wrongful termination, in favor of the plaintiff. Retaliation for exercising protected leave, in favor of the plaintiff. David gripped Marisol's hand so tightly his knuckles went white, barely breathing, watching Sarah's face for some sign of how big this really was before his own mind could catch up to the words. The jury awarded David back pay, compensatory damages for the financial and emotional hardship he had endured, and, in a decision that sent a message far beyond that single courtroom, punitive damages against Vantage Logistics for what the jury described in their finding as a calculated corporate decision made with reckless disregard for the well-being of an employee and his child. Somewhere behind him, David heard Marisol let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh, and it was only then, hearing that sound, that the verdict finally felt real. When David walked out of the courthouse that evening, the storm clouds that had hung over the city all week were finally breaking apart, spilling gold light across the wet steps. Lily was there, waiting with Marisol, and the moment she saw her father, she broke into a run-yellow raincoat, flapping braids bouncing, and leapt straight into his arms the way she used to when she was small enough to be carried everywhere. David caught her, laughing and crying at the same time, holding her the way he'd wanted to hold her every single day of the 11-month fight that had brought them here. The story didn't end quietly either. Word of the verdict spread through industry circles quickly, in part because the punitive damages were significant enough to make headlines in regional business news, and in part because 2 other former Vantage employees came forward within weeks, describing strikingly similar experiences of being let go shortly after taking family or medical leave. Sarah took on both cases, and both settled well before trial, the company clearly unwilling to risk another jury reading Calloway's own words back to him in open court. Vantage Logistics, facing mounting scrutiny from investors and local news alike, quietly overhauled its leave and termination policies, adding new layers of review specifically designed to prevent leave usage from ever again factoring into workforce reduction decisions. 6 months after the verdict, the company announced Richard Calloway's departure as CEO, framed carefully in a press release as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities, language David found almost funny given how differently the same company had described his own departure less than a year earlier. A trade publication that had once profiled Calloway as a ruthless cost-cutter ran a much shorter follow-up piece this time, noting simply that the board had decided a change in leadership was in the company's best long-term interest. David used part of the settlement to pay off every debt that had piled up during the fight, the overdue rent, the car payment, the small emergency loan Marisol had quietly co-signed without ever mentioning it to him until the case was over. With what remained, he did something he had dreamed about during the darkest nights of the case. He rented a tiny storefront office 2 blocks from the apartment, put a handwritten sign in the window, and started a small, mostly free consulting service helping hourly workers understand their rights before they ever needed a lawyer. He knew from first-hand experience exactly how alone and lost a person felt the day a termination letter landed in their inbox with no warning attached, and he wanted there to be somewhere those people could walk in the same week it happened, rather than months later once the damage had already compounded. Word spread slowly at first, mostly through people Tasha knew from her years at Vantage, then faster once a local news segment picked up David's story as a follow-up to the verdict. He kept a simple binder behind the front desk, one section for leave laws, one for wrongful termination basics, one just for sample letters people could use to request their own employment records. He wasn't a lawyer and never pretended to be one. Every case that needed real legal firepower, he referred straight to Sarah's office, and more than once he sat in on those first meetings himself, translating the unfamiliar legal language into plain words for people too exhausted and frightened to fully process it alone. More than once, sitting across the desk from someone in the exact position he'd been in 8 months earlier, he found himself saying the same 4 words Sarah had once said to him, and meaning them just as fully, "We are going to fight." Marisol became the office's part-time bookkeeper on weekends, still working her paralegal job during the week, joking that she'd traded 1 filing cabinet for 2. Greg Sanderson, of all people, reached out nearly a year after the verdict, having left Vantage himself not long after Calloway's departure, and asked if David needed help. He'd spent 15 years learning logistics scheduling and thought there might be a way to build something useful out of it, a tool to help hourly workers track their own hours and leave requests so no company could ever again quietly rewrite the record after the fact. David said yes without hesitation. It felt, in a strange and unplanned way, like something good had been built directly out of the wreckage of the worst year of his life. Lily, for her part, remembers that year mostly in fragments. The hospital room, the yellow raincoat, the courthouse steps, and the way her father held her that evening like he was never going to let go again. She's older now, and she still keeps one of David's old lunch note jokes taped inside a keepsake box, the same crooked handwriting, the same dumb joke about why the chicken crossed the road. Some things, it turns out, a company with hundreds of millions of dollars and a glass office on the top floor can never actually take away. What David's story proves, more than anything, is that power doesn't always win. Not when it's built on the assumption that ordinary people are too tired, too broke, or too afraid to push back. A single dad with $43 in his account and a sick daughter in the hospital took on a CEO who thought his signature on a termination letter was the final word. It wasn't. David Reyes got the last one instead, and it echoed a lot further than one courtroom ever could. If David's fight for his daughter moved you even a little, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories like it, because there are a lot more ordinary people out there who refuse to back down, and their stories deserve to be told too.